So, did you ever have a time as a kid where you got a new toy or a new video game or something and you really wanted to play it, but you couldn't until you had finished your homework or until finals were done and it just drove you crazy? Well, that's what the last week has been like for me because if there's anything about men, is that in general, we don't really grow up. It's just our toys get much more expensive. And so that's what I have for you today. So in this video, I'm going to build my new computer. This computer cost me about 160,000 yen. I hesitate to call it a build guide though, because I don't really have the means to accurately film me putting it piece by piece together. But I am going to build the computer on camera today, and I'm going to walk you through my part selection. So this will give you a good idea of how I thought about picking my computer parts, which might help you with your decisions, as well as giving you a good understanding of building a computer in general if you are interested and want to look into that further. So, with that said, let's get started. Alright, so I cleaned up the workspace a little bit to make it a little easier to work with. And obviously the first thing to start with is the motherboard and the CPU. And to talk about the selection a little bit while I open it is, oh, I also have the RAM up here, is my first pick was actually not this CPU and motherboard. My ideal CPU was going to be the Ryzen 5 5600. And the reason I didn't get that was because it was on a really good sale, but because the sale was so good, it was sold out by the time I got to the store. And so if you have a good pick between the Ryzen 5 5600 or the Intel i5 12400, either of them is a great pick. You can't go wrong with either depending on what you have, and really I'd say your decision comes down to how good the sale is. Now, since the 5600 was sold out, it was down to the 12400, I thought, but actually the 12400 and this Ryzen 7 5700X were about the same price. And so the motherboard came down to a bundle sale that the store was having, where if you got this CPU and this motherboard, they knocked a few bucks off the price for you. We'll need a SATA cable, so I'll take that out of the motherboard now. And you want somewhere safe to work on this, so I'm going to use the motherboard box to hold the motherboard while I put everything on it. Alright, I looked through the quick installation a little bit, and it seems about as far as I remember. So, one thing to keep in mind is the 5000 series AMD, and before that as well, use a pin grid array format, which means that the pins that connect the CPU and the motherboard are actually on the CPU. Now this is different from AMD 7000 series and Intel, which uses an LGA or LAN grid array, which means that the pins are on the motherboard and not on the CPU. I actually support that decision to switch to that because the pins are very fragile, very small, hundreds of pins on these things, which means they're very easy to break or bend. And if a pin were to bend, I would prefer it to happen on the motherboard, which is much easier to replace than on the CPU. So I'm glad about that change. But for this CPU, lift the retention arm on the motherboard so that's upright like this. Next, locate the very small triangle on one corner of the CPU socket And there is also a small triangle on one corner of the CPU itself, and you want to line those up. And while you're handling the CPU, try not to touch the top, only hold from the sides ideally. Now I'm probably going to go quiet because I don't want to break this, so once it's in the socket, simply push the retention arm back down and lock it in, and you've installed your CPU. Alright, so next I'm going to install my RAM. This is one spot where you could also save some money if you downgraded to a 5600. And I say that because I actually got 32 gigs of DDR4. It's 3200 megahertz. As far as how much RAM you need, I would say if all you're doing is YouTube and browsing the internet, maybe a Word document or something like that, you're probably fine with 8. If all you're doing is gaming, or if you're doing gaming and some light video work or programming or something, 16 is probably fine. And so why did I get 32? Well, I got 32 because it was only about $10 more than the 16 gig for some reason. This was on a really good sale. And because I'm sure it will help quite a bit with the videos I make for this channel. And I also wanted to try working on some virtual machines, which can use up a lot of RAM to test out different things. So I decided, let's just go all in, get the 32 gigs now, and so I can still have 2 slots open in case I ever need 64 for some reason. Now, when you install the RAM, obviously it goes in the 4 slots on the side. Some motherboards might have 2, especially if you went with an ITX motherboard. But typically they will go in the farthest socket. Oh, it only opens on one side on this. Some motherboards will open on both sides. Some of them only lock on one side. This one only locks. But typically it will be the furthest out, and then skip one and go to the third furthest out. And this is to activate dual channels, so you get the most bandwidth out of your RAM. To install it, you take your RAM stick, and if you'll notice, it's keyed. Right here on the RAM stick, there's one spot cut out. That's to ensure that you do not install it the wrong way. So when you install it, you simply line up the key with the RAM stick, push it into where it's keyed correctly, and then with both fingers, push firmly down until it clicks. It won't always click, so don't slam your fingers through your motherboard, but you do have to push rather firmly to get it to lock itself in. So, second stick, same as the first, line it up so with the key. Alright, your RAM is now installed. Next, because I know it's very clunky to do inside the case, I'm going to install my SSD because that's relatively easy, and then my CPU cooler. So, here we go. For my SSD, I went with a 3rd gen NVMe SSD, which goes up to 3 terabytes. 350 megabytes read speeds, well, up to 2, so take that for what it's worth. And I didn't go with a Gen 4 just to save a little bit of money. It was about $40 cheaper, where this cost me the equivalent of about $100 US. This is actually the first computer I've ever had that will be 100% solid state. Normally I have a SSD boot drive and then a larger storage drive, but I decided, well, once you're spending this much money, let's see how it is, right? NVMe SSDs like this are keyed, just like RAM. Hopefully you can see that. So they only install one way. Alright, so the SSD is now installed. Next, the CPU cooler. If you get the two CPUs I mentioned before, the i5-12400 or the Ryzen 5 5600, they will include a cooler in the box, so this cooler might not be necessary for you. But when I upgraded to the 5700X, I forgot that I would also need to get a CPU cooler with that. So I just picked up a nice one, I hope, from Deep Cool. Alright, and I'm just going to follow the installation instructions, so I'll see you in a bit. When you tighten things down, remember to do it in a sort of cross shape. Otherwise, you can put too much pressure on one corner. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter as much when you're just installing the frame, but especially when you're installing the tower, do the cross pattern. Alright, next is the thermal compound. Now, Deep Cool included some, and I didn't buy any, so hopefully this is good. If you buy one of the CPUs that comes with a cooler, that cooler should already have some thermal compound pre-applied, so you don't need any extra. However, for this I have to use the included because there's none pre-applied to the bottom of the CPU's cooler. So let's see how it goes. So when you apply it yourself, you want about the size of a long grain of rice or about a pea, which is almost exactly as much as they included in this tube. Now, when you install the tower, I want the air to push towards the back of the case, and the fan should include an arrow on the side that points in the direction that the air will shoot out. So I'll install it so that it shoots backwards. And then remember to take the sticker off the bottom. That's very important. Next, similar to what I said before, you want to tighten the screws going back and forth. You don't want to apply all pressure to one side. Finally, we plug this into the CPU fan header. And if your CPU does not have an if your CPU cooler does not have an RGB light, you won't need this step, but the second cable is to plug directly into the RGB pattern software on the motherboard. So if you wanted to test the complete computer before you plug it in, sadly this CPU does not have an integrated graphics, so I need the GPU to do that, which you can put the GPU in like this and test it and make sure it's all running. But for me, I'm going to go straight into installing it into the case. So give me a minute. Okay, I cleaned up a little bit. Here is the case I went with. It was the MSI Mag Vampiric 100R. The reason I got it is, as you probably expect from the theme of the build, it was on sale. To me, a case is just a relatively pretty box, so I don't care too much about spending, over $100 on a case. And so this is what I went with. It's got a nice tempered glass side panel. It's got a nice... The fans are not RGB, I believe, but this stripe is RGB, which gives it a nice little accent, I guess. And it looked relatively easy to build in, which I think is the most important thing to me, really. Trick of the trade. Now that the panel's off, put it straight into the box. That way you don't lose it. Alright, a few of the motherboard standoffs appear to be installed, but I'm just gonna sort of hover the motherboard in place to get an idea of which ones are missing. 3 are not installed. This motherboard already has a I/O shield installed. If yours does not, it will come in the motherboard box and you have to pop it in yourself. But for me, all that is taken care of. Alright, now it's time to install. Alright, now my motherboard is installed. That took a lot more work than I expected. But next we'll install the power supply. Let's talk about the power supply. Now the power supply, let me just say this. This is the one spot to not cheap out on. You can get a cheaper case, you can reduce your storage to save some money to a limit. There's a lot of things you can do to try and cut some dollars out of a build. But the one spot to never cut out on is the power supply. Get something that is more than adequate for your hardware. So the CPU and the GPU will probably be the most powerful things you have. So get something that's more than capable for your hardware and is from a reputable brand that has a good track record. I didn't say it yet, but mine is a 80 Plus Gold by Seasonic. Seasonic's a good brand. There's a lot of other good brands. I've had good luck with EVGA before, and a few other brands. Corsair, I think, is another good one. But don't cheap out on the power supply is all I'm asking. This case has a sort of, you can see it better from the front, a sort of lower compartment for the power supply. Alright, next, before I install GPU and everything, let's pre-run some of these cables. Alright, now we need to plug in the case cables. For example, the USB 3 and 2 on the front, as well as the audio, the power reset switch and LEDs. So there are a few more annoying cables to install. First, there's the sort of I/O up here with the power switch, the reset switch, and the lights. So that one's annoying because if you look here, it's many different cables that are all together, and you have to put them in just right. That's one spot that's very easy to mess up on your first computer, trust me. Alright, so I actually had to go to the website to find where the connectors are for the front panel stuff because it is very tiny font. Should be a front audio. Here it is. And all of these are keyed, by the way, so be careful. And I believe that's everything, but I'm going to do one more check on the cables. Alright, now is the most important thing for any gaming rig, and that is the graphics card. As you can see, I went with the 3060 Ti. I did not like the way NVIDIA was going with their 4000 series, so I didn't want to buy one of those. And AMD has a lot of competitive GPUs, but in my experience and from what I could see on benchmarks, which is what I always think you should base your decisions off of, NVIDIA still has the most interesting tech and also they are the best in most of productivity options. So I figured if I wanted this to be the best gaming, uh, editing, programming, all around workstation that I could make it, I thought that the 3060 Ti was right in my budget and it ticked all the boxes for me. But there are many AMD options as well. So let's get this baby out. As you can see, this one is also MSI. I did not plan that at all. I promise. I have an MSI motherboard, MSI case, and now an MSI GPU. But I purely went into the store. I was looking at all the options, and I got whatever was the best bang for the buck. The motherboard came in a set with the CPU, so I did not decide on that directly. The case was the cheapest that I could get that had a good airflow and filtration, so I went with this case. And this 3060 was about the same in terms of overclock as all the other 3060s, but was about $20 less. And so it just happened that way, I swear. So let's get this GPU out. Oh wow, this is a lot bigger than the last graphics card I had. Oh. It's even got a nice backplate. It looks great. Yep, 3 display ports, 1 HDMI. Oh my god, this thing is tall. The last desktop graphics card I had was the NVIDIA 970. It was very long ago. It had a little bit of drama with how they misrepresented the VRAM on it, where it was advertised as 4 when really it was 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM at full speed, and then there was a half gigabyte that was at a reduced speed. And so I actually ended up getting a little bit of a refund years later because of that drama. But that was the last GPU I had, and this thing by comparison is much bigger. It's crazy how big graphics cards have gotten. Anyway, so to install it in the case, first remember to take off the PCI slot cover off the bottom. And then, on most modern motherboards, because GPUs have gotten so heavy, the top slot is kind of reinforced. But so you always want to install in as close to the top slot as you can get. There's many reasons to that. One is it's reinforced. 2 is it's usually the fastest connection to the CPU, so it gets the least amount of latency. But you want to install in the topmost slot you can. That is the full width. You pop it open similar to the RAM. So on my case, I didn't realize this in store, or I probably would have got a different one. My back slots actually pop out. Anyway, remove the back covers on the slots you'll be using. Alright, now with the back slots out, we can push the card in. Then you need to screw it in. Alright, that card's not going anywhere. Next, take the power cable from the power supply, plug it into the GPU, and now all that's left is cable management and turning it on. But before I do the cable management, I really want to turn it on. So I think for that, just because I don't want to mess with my desk setup yet, I'm just gonna swing this arm out like this and test it. Alright, here's the first turn on. As everyone knows, It is bad luck to put on the side panels before turning on the computer. So, let me do a check. Alright, I flipped the power switch on the power supply. Everything's connected as far as I can tell. I got this monitor plugged in, so you should be able to see everything that I see. And I got this keyboard and mouse ready. Please work. If this doesn't work, I might cry. So, 3, 2, 1. We got lights. All the fans are spinning. Why aren't you working? Are you off? Oh, it's upside down because I have it mounted upside down. Okay, this is gonna be uncomfortable. So in Windows, I had it set up to flip this monitor so that it could run fine. Sadly, I forgot about that, and now it's upside down. But let me check. I'll try and screenshot it and flip it upright for you to see. CPU's detected. All 32 gigs of RAM are detected. Can I find the... Yep, two 16 gigs of Corsair detected. Though it's not running at full speed. I'll have to figure that out. My M.2 SSD is detected. It's not a lot of RGB, but it is pretty nice. It's tasteful. It's tasteful RPG. It's tasteful RGB. Okay, so let's try and... Oh yeah, you can use a mouse in most... Long time ago, you couldn't use a mouse in the BIOS. So now that I can confirm everything's working, I'm going to power it off and do some cable management. So, let's get started. Here's the biggest secret you need to know about cable management. The second you put this cover on, none of it matters. I think it looks pretty good. Alright, now for the main case. It is tempered glass, so I do have to be a little careful. And with that, I have one final peel. Let's cherish it together. And with that, my first PC in, for me personally, this is my first PC in about 10 years that I built. I've bought laptops and stuff. And as far as, you know, building for other people and stuff included, this is my first PC in about 5 years. So, I'm so happy that it turns on. I'm so excited that it works. So now that the PC's built, I wanted to give you a little bit of a rundown of how it's performing. So I got some benchmarks and stuff to show you guys. This first slide is just the specs of the PC. So I'll give you a minute to check out everything that I got. And I've never done this before in one of my videos, but I do want to say that this video took a lot of effort. So if you are liking what you're seeing, please consider subscribing or dropping a like. I would really appreciate it. All right, so to start, let's see some synthetic benchmarks. First, we got Cinebench. As you can see, the new computer is much faster than my old laptop on both the single core and the multi-core, but it is a lot newer, and you only would notice that difference in a heavily demanding task like gaming or video editing. Next, we got Premiere Pro export times. For this test, I exported my previous video on trackball mice and I compared the export times of each. I will say that my test method was not perfectly ideal because I was using the same drive to edit off of and export to, which could slow down export times a bit, especially because it's a hard drive and not a SSD. But you can clearly see a large improvement with my new computer. And let's start with some gaming benchmarks. I got a few CPU bound games first. This is the Civilization 6. I ran all of my testing on high settings, the high setting preset with motion blur off if it was there because I do not like motion blur. So this is Civilization 6, and as you can see, a very large, almost double improvement in FPS on the new computer. Next, we got Ashes of the Singularity. Again, a typically CPU bound game, and not quite as big of an improvement here in terms of averages, but what the Ashes of the Singularity benchmark did not show was the minimums, and it was very stuttery on my laptop, very uncomfortably so. Now we'll get into some more graphically demanding games. The first one I have is Metro Exodus, the PC Enhanced Edition. I tried running it on the old laptop, but it would not run. It repeatedly errored out, so I do not have data for that, but you can see how fast the new computer is at 1080p. And even with ray tracing high, the average is still in the about 65 frames per second range, which to me is more than playable. Though, admittedly, I am the type of person who will drop the graphics down to low to get a consistent 120 FPS if I have to. So now probably two of the most recent games in my library are Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands. So first we have Borderlands 3. The the minimum 99 percentile is awful. I almost never like playing this game because of how stuttery it is. I usually have to turn it down to very low. Now, Tiny Tina's Wonderland, probably the newest game in my library, to be honest. And you can see that the minimums are almost 3 times higher, not quite. And even the average is almost twice as high. Again, a very large improvement that I'm very happy with. This not quite as new, but a very popular game, Batman Arkham Knight. We have the new computer being almost double on the minimums and not quite double, but almost 120 FPS on the average, which for my monitor topping out at 144 FPS is very good to me. And in case you're curious, I have a little bit on the power consumption and the temps of the new computer. This is one spot where you have to give laptops credit. The GPU alone consumes consumes almost 200 watts, which is about as much as the power brick for the entire laptop. But as you can see, with the
with the included compound on my CPU cooler, we topped out at about 60 degrees on the CPU with a max power draw of about 78 watts. And on the GPU, we top out at about 75 degrees, 74 degrees, with the power consumption topping out right at that 200 watts. So with that said, back to past me right after building it.
But that is the end of the video. Thank you for watching on this very long awaited journey for me. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.